Hello, everyone. My name is Fritz Schroeder, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We were founded in 1969 by a small group of hunters, anglers, and naturalists who banded together to acquire and protect our critical forests, wetlands, and streams with the belief that some land is so beautiful and rare it should be protected for the public forever. The urgency that drove our founders continues today as we accelerate our efforts to strategically protect and restore more fragmented forests, to expand and connect our existing preserves, and to create new preserves, all the while building out infrastructure and parking lots, trails, and signage that allow access for the public while also protecting these incredible ecosystems. We recently protected our 8,000th acre, a momentous occasion for a little land trust like ourselves. These 49 nature preserves have over 40 miles of streams and hiking trails open for you and I to enjoy 365 days per year. We started Nature Hour 18 months ago at the height of the pandemic because we wanted to stay connected with you, our community. We were inspired and challenged by the many people that were flocking to our trails and nature preserves. We wanted to create connections and invite experts, friends, and colleagues to give voice to the many wonders of nature. Our entire team looks forward to this educational forum, and we want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. This is our final Nature Hour for the fall, but I'm excited to share that we will be back with a new season in January. Look for details in the coming weeks. If you're interested in supporting the Conservancy beyond attending Nature Hour, please mark your calendars for Friday, November 19th, which is Extraordinary Give, and right around the corner, a day of community giving and support for local nonprofits here in Lancaster. Please consider a donation to the Conservancy during Extraordinary Give to help us save woods and water. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, Clark Associates, Electron Energy, DART, RETTEW Associates, PennStone, and Nimblist. Thank you to these companies for your commitment to supporting the Lancaster Conservancy's work. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Keith Williams, our Community Engagement Coordinator, who will introduce our presenters for the evening.
Thanks, Fritz, and thank you all for joining us tonight as we explore this really important topic of bat ecology and conservation. So, bats play critically important roles in our environment, and they've suffered huge losses in their populations due to habitat loss and diseases in recent years. And tonight, it's my pleasure to have two friends join us as we look at bat conservation and ecology from both a national and a local perspective. Our first presenter is Dr. Kimberly Williams. Kimberly Winter is NatureWatch National Program Manager. Kimberly Williams is my sister, by the way. Kimberly Winter is the NatureWatch National Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service in Washington, D.C. She holds a PhD in wildlife ecology and management and a master's degree in ecological anthropology. Throughout her career in both the nonprofit sector and in public service, Kim has sought ways to bring the value of conservation to the public eye by promoting opportunities for general audiences to immerse themselves fully in nature, whether through programs like freshwater snorkeling or special events hosted by national forest and national grasslands like Fishing Days, Bat Week, and Pollinator Week, or online through media hosted by the NatureWatch website, which is www.fs.fed.us/naturewatch, and we'll put that in the chat. Kim is the co-founder of Bat Week and continues to serve on its annual planning committee. And Dr. Dan Ardia is our second presenter this evening. He is a professor of biology at Franklin and Marshall College. His primary research interest is understanding how organisms interact with their environment in response to rapid environmental change. Much of his research focuses on the physiology and behavior of birds across the world, including Africa, South America, and Alaska. But he and his students also conduct local research projects, which include forest mammals, urban bats, and the broader urban and social ecology of the city of Lancaster. Dan is currently the past president of the Association of Field Ornithologists, and he sits on the board of directors of the Lancaster Conservancy. Thank you, Dan, for your service there. He's also a board member of the Pennsylvania Master Naturalist and the Millport Conservancy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Winter.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm so happy to be joining you on this topic. This is one of my favorite topics in the whole universe. And I appreciate Keith and Kelly and Fritz for inviting me to your Nature Hour. I'm going to go ahead and start my own little timesheet here so that I can make sure I don't speak too long and use up Dan's time as well. So what I'm going to present on is the future for bats. And what I want to impart to you is just changing that narrative from scary to superhero. What's really scary in this world is that the status of global bats is pretty poor. We've got about 1,300 to 1,400 species of bats worldwide, and so many of them are critically endangered. 21 is the last estimate that we got from Bat Conservation International and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So these stats come straight from those websites. Global bats are amazing. They're diverse. They eat everything from pollen to nectar to insects to fruits, frogs, fish, you name it. Bats are pretty much involved in it. And they're just amazing little critters. And the scary part is that the ones that used to be so common here in the United States are now becoming uncommon thanks to a very destructive fungus that has hit cave-dwelling bats in the US, and I'll get into a little more about that in a minute. Some of the other threats to bats, besides white nose syndrome, which is that fungus that attacks them in caves, include habitat loss, which we all play a part in, destruction of some of the roost sites, which some people intentionally destroy when they go into caves and mess up cave sites. Mines are another location of roost sites, so we have to keep people out of some of these locations to keep them undisturbed, and also to keep fungus and other pathogens from entering those caves. It's believed that the white nose syndrome was caused by a fungus that was introduced by cavers. So spelunkers came in with some of this fungus, which is well known in Europe, and spread it to the little critters here. And the bats here are unable to fend off the fungus and stay healthy. So they end up coming out of a hibernation, getting out of the cave, kind of rubbing themselves, trying to get that fungus off, find no food, and then end up perishing in large quantities, both in caves and outside of caves, thanks to that introduced pathogen. Wind energy, this is something that affects you all in Pennsylvania. Some of those turbines are both attractants to bats, both because of the heat and the movement that attracts certain insects to them, as well as there's some research reporting that the air pressure differences when the bats come into those locations where the wind and energy turbines are located can literally cause them to combust from within. So that's a biggie. And I know that a lot of energy companies are working with bat advocacy organizations, trying to figure out how to either slow, stall, or otherwise work around the velocity of the pattern of wind that's occurring with those turbines to try to reduce the losses to bats as well as to other birds and wildlife that are attracted to them. Climate change is a big one. We're right in the middle of climate change talks on a global level, and it's continuing to impact bats, both because of habitats in forests and deserts, as well as caves that are getting warmer as some of those climate change impacts affect the internal temperatures and humidity of caves. Overuse of pesticides is a big one that we all play a part in. A lot of us are spraying the heck out of our yards and also getting rid of every critter that comes along. And we need to take a harder look at how we can more organically or naturally control pests, and bats can help with that. Poor public image is another thing that really affects our little bats. And that's something that myself and several other agencies and organizations have been working to counteract. And I'll talk about that a little bit further in this presentation. The one thing that we don't do here in North America is really harvest them for bushmeat. So beyond that, and you can see the wind turbines in this picture, those are bird fatalities at the base of it. The one thing that we haven't done is overharvest them for bushmeat, which is more common in tropical regions of the world and quite a big concern as they get harvested in large quantities for food. So by protecting bats and thinking about bats and participating in their protection, we can protect the functioning of ecosystems worldwide. Pollination by bats is very common in tropical zones. They were originally responsible for pollinating fruits such as bananas, which are now since cloned. but they do participate in pollinating wild bananas, as well as the agave plant, which is used for tequila, for any tequila drinkers, as well as several other well-known tropical fruits and vegetables. Seed dispersal is a biggie in the tropics as well. And of course, nutrient cycling, where the guano from bats is very rich for nutrients. Here in the US, bats are really helping out with food supplies by controlling crop pests and other nuisance insects naturally. So they're out there chomping away at those flying insects, which has been estimated to assist farmers to the tune of from $3 to $54 billion in natural pest control annually. And also we're discovering a lot about medicines and engineering through bats, most often from things like the anticoagulants found in vampire bat saliva, as well as other things used to control and understand better things such as strokes and blood conditions in people. So I'm going to address an initial myth here that came out last year when the coronavirus really hit, when COVID-19 was really hitting. There was a few news reports that I caught that were talking about the connection between bats and coronaviruses. Coronaviruses are natural in wildlife, in the outdoors. And the novel coronavirus that has caused COVID-19 is not directly related to bats. So while there was some talk about the Wuhan markets and wildlife sold there, the connection is that wildlife that might be in unsanitary conditions in markets where blood and feces and saliva are coming into contact with one another may be the cause of spreading diseases and zoonoses such as coronaviruses, but they are not responsible for COVID-19. If you leave bats and the other wildlife in their natural habitats, you won't have that human to wildlife connection, and we won't have to worry about these things as much. So that's a good plug for protecting natural environments for bats and other wildlife. You cannot catch COVID-19 from a bat, and there is no evidence that any North American bats are a source of SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID. Only humans can spread this virus to other humans, so keep that in mind. And if anybody says, I'm going to go kill some bats, because this has happened since the COVID epidemic has been a pandemic, please urge them to get a little bit more information before they take any steps against our little critters known as bats. What I want to cover here is our strategy for saving bats, and both realizing that they are superheroes as well as being a superhero for them. I'm going to discuss very quickly some research and monitoring at a very high level that we're doing here at the Forest Service, some conservation actions on the ground, and then what we can all do both in action as well as education and outreach. So a little bit about Pennsylvania's bats, and I know that Dan's going to get into more detail about Pennsylvania and some of your local connections, but we've got about 9 species of bats here in Pennsylvania. You've got the big brown bat, the eastern red bat, the evening bat, the northern yellow bat, the Seminole bat, the silver-haired bat, the Indiana myotis, otherwise known as the Indiana bat, the little brown myotis or little brown bat, and the northern long-eared myotis. And those last 3 have been really hit by white nose syndrome. So research and monitoring of white nose. What you can see in the little photo of the bat here is the fungus on its face. That is not its natural color. That's literally a fungus growing on its face while it's trying to hibernate in a cave, and it spread from bat to bat at this point. What you see in the lower corner of this picture, unfortunately, is just a pile of little dead bats. And it's just heartbreaking to see up to 90% losses of bat populations in some caves where they were once so very prevalent. And have we also, and I won't draw too much of a conclusion here, but haven't we also noticed an increase in mosquitoes in the last several years? Just saying, we might need more of these bats around. The bat species that have been identified with diagnostic symptoms related to white nose syndrome include these little guys that are located in Pennsylvania: the big brown, the Indiana, the little brown bat, and the northern long-eared bat. So you have 4 species of bats that are getting hit with white nose syndrome, and we really need some more research and also some kind of cure to this fungus and the other pathogens that are affecting these guys in their sleep. There's a lot going on with white nose syndrome. There's a whole interagency group, and that's USGS, which is the Geological Survey, the United States Department of Agriculture, APHIS, which is the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, the Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All of us have gotten together in these strategy forming, research, and monitoring groups, and we are hosting a website known as whitenose-syndrome.org that you're welcome to go to for more information. This map here shows the original instance reported of white nose syndrome in New York back in 2006, I believe, and how it has spread throughout the United States ever since. So the color coding just relates to the years in which white nose syndrome has been identified in cave dwelling bats. And unfortunately has spread to the west. There used to be a barrier created by the Rocky Mountains. That is no longer the case. It is all the way out west and into Canada. So we've got a problem on our hands. And looking at white nose syndrome here in Pennsylvania, you can see that Lancaster has not been affected, but nearby York has. So we've got white nose all around us, and we need our bats back. What can we do to help them? So I'm gonna jump into some of the research that's ongoing. There's another group practicing the North American Bat Monitoring Program, or NABAT, and this is a little bit fuzzy, but the blue in this map is indicating some cells that we're monitoring using these protocols that also touch on Forest Service lands or National Forest Service land. And then acoustic surveys are represented by the black dots. So what we're doing, we're getting out there with monitoring systems. We're listening for the bats to identify what species we're finding. We're locating where they are in caves, mines, and forests. And we're trying to get involved in just a nationwide effort to monitor and protect the bats. Here back at the Forest Service, we've got scientists such as Dr. Dan Ardia, who are studying their seasonal movement patterns between their wintering hibernacula and their summer breeding habitat for two of the species that you find here in Pennsylvania, the northern long-eared and the little brown bat. We're also taking a look at when they're coming out of their caves and mapping their genomes and taking a look at the immunity of pre and post white nose syndrome little brown bat populations. So what's happening before, and we're testing to see their immunity to white nose, and what's happening after. Are they adapting to white nose syndrome? And just in case you're unfamiliar with white nose, it was brought from Europe, and the bats in Europe are not plagued by it. So there must be some evolutionary adaptation that has allowed them to exist in unison with white nose without being devastated by it. Here in the States, that's not the case, and we're losing bats faster than they can grow themselves back. So trying to identify how they can be more resistant is a very important detail. Other research and monitoring that's going on by Dr. Susan Loeb from our Southern Research Station includes some other bats' responses to white nose syndrome, some of the roosting and foraging ecology, and also trying to identify some better habitat practices that we can instill. So a little result of the research that Dr. Loeb has conducted in South Carolina shows that some of the tricolored bats are moving deeper into the caves to get to more colder environment where the fungus that causes white nose syndrome slows down. So will that increase their survival, and will other bats follow suit in their behaviors? So what can we do next? We got to translate this research and monitoring to action, right? First thing we can do is protect and restore habitat. Pennsylvania is home to about 4,000 mines and about 35,000 natural caves. And you also are host to one of the identified locations of one of the largest hibernacula of Indiana bats, which is on the list for being endangered. Canoe Creek State Park, in particular, Hartman Mine in Blair County, is the host to this hibernacula. And so that's kind of a nice feature of Pennsylvania bat ecology, that you guys have one of the hot spots for seeing them. Now, do we want to go hiking into that cave? No, because we don't want to carry in potentially some disease, but we do want to see them emerge. And I think that would be a pretty cool field trip for folks at the Conservancy if you're thinking of getting out of your county and maybe traveling around to look at some of the bats after the presentation. Maybe next spring or summer, you can take a peek at those Indiana bats. Forest habitat and access to clean water, which you can hopefully see in the screen thing behind me. All bats in North America are keen on living near some forest habitat, with the exception of the desert bats out southwest. And everybody needs clean water. So that's a good way to attract bats and to restore their habitat and protect them and get them back up to the populations that they need to be. Another good way to help out bats would be to make a home for them. So garden for bats and build or buy a bat roosting box. Some people install these bat roosting boxes and they ask, what's going on? How come they're not in there? You may have enough or sufficient forest habitat to allow the bats to just naturally be roosting. And in some cases, that's why they're not coming into your roosting box. In other cases, they just need to find it, and you need to position it appropriately on a pole with the right aspect towards the sun in order to attract them to it. I'm a big proponent of gardening for bats, and by that, I mean several things. And strangely enough, I'm gonna send you to a pollinator website. So pollinator.org has these really cool eco-regional guides for pollinator plantings, and yours is in the Eastern Broadleaf. If you look up the zip code for the Conservancy, if you get some night blooming flowers out in your garden and provide a good water source, maybe even welcome some insects into your garden by reducing or eliminating your use of pesticides, you might find some bats hanging around your yard, taking care of some of the nuisance pests like mosquitoes and some of the crop pests, and just hanging out, having a little meal at night, which is super fun to watch with kids and with family and friends. Another good idea is to get those invasives out of your habitat and clear the way. Try to plant some native plants and get the bats to come back into your neighborhood. And I have some resources listed here that you can use for figuring out how to build a bat house and also for getting that garden out there for bats. So the whole goal here is really to change the narrative for them. We want to understand them through research and monitoring. We want to provide some actions on the ground to help them. And then lastly, but not least, we want to share what we know about bats with others. And that gets back to what I mentioned in the beginning about poor public image. Bats are suffering from a pretty poor public image. They've really been associated with Halloween and Dracula and vampire bats and scary things, and they look creepy. And I happen to love them, but I think they look like little dogs, and I love dogs. So let's change that narrative for bats. Are bats scary and creepy, or are they superheroes and pretty darn cool? Well, one of the ways that we got to promote bats, if you haven't heard of it yet, I hope you will, is Bat Week. And we literally started Bat Week in 2017 by asking the Secretary of Agriculture to sign a proclamation for Bat Week, much like we did in 2007 for Pollinator Week. And so what do we do with Bat Week? Well, this is an awareness building endeavor. So over the last several years, we have celebrated it. It's now international and it's running its own. So by that, I mean, whereas all these agencies and organizations and bat advocates used to try to push Bat Week out there, it's kind of gained a life on its own. And so a lot of organizations, schools, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, governments, state governments have already started just automatically celebrating Bat Week as an annual event. And the whole point is to raise awareness about them and their conservation. That first proclamation was signed by the Secretary of Ag. And guess what? The state of Pennsylvania also had a proclamation signed. We didn't push for these proclamations to be signed in 2020 because of COVID, but we are going to be pushing for them anew as soon as we get past this pandemic. So what happens when you proclaim Bat Week? You basically acknowledge the role of bats in your local economy, agriculture, the role of them to enhance and otherwise support ecosystems, and use it as a little bit of PR for them to kind of deter people from the ominous, oh, it's Halloween, bats are scary thoughts. So we've opened up a website, batweek.org, where we talk about why bats matter. We give people actions that they can take. We talk about events. There's a calendar on there for annual events, and we just passed Bat Week for this year, but we'll be moving into Bat Week for next year. There's lots of educational materials and also some videos, which include things as fun as, you know, having a bat biologist read a book to kids, or talk about what kind of habitat you can put out in your backyard. So lots of resources there that I would encourage everyone who wants to advocate for bats to go grab. There's a Project EduBat kit that we have, which are these trunks that we fill with materials, including books and videos and activities for children, a bat box and some puppets, all kinds of things, kind of a bat in a box. So everything you would need to go and do a bat program is in the Project EduBat kit. And we have those available for free that we will ship out to people who would like to use them. So they can go do a program and then send it back to us. Bats Live was a distance learning adventure that we did a number of years ago. It included a year-long curricula for teachers and students that were using those in middle school, roughly middle school age. They were following along with the program and activities. And then at the end of the year, there was a live program that was hosted outside of Bracken Cave in Texas, which is one of the largest hibernacula of the Mexican free-tailed bat. And so the bats, for Bats Live, you can still see the recorded broadcast for this and still use it if educators are curious about it. Bat Squad kid ambassadors were out there. These kids were kid on kid talking about bats and the benefits of bats, making videos and talking about it. That's still kind of ongoing if people would like to submit videos to that. And then of course, we talk about outreach. So getting the word out about Bat Week in particular is a great opportunity to spread the word about all kinds of bat facts and advocate for them. And then we also talk about doing some other outreach. These little wildlife acoustics monitors that you can put on your smartphone or tablet will help you get out and take a bat walk with friends or with family or with kids. And the monitors will identify the species of bat by their echolocation, which is super cool and fun. And then we also completed this year on the Bat Week website some new recipes that we collected all over North and Central and South America. And it's ingredients that were in some way bat assisted. So fruits or vegetables that were either pollinated or seed dispersed or insects were controlled by bats. And so we're encouraging people to think creatively of ways to do outreach and advocate for bats in ways that will help people really understand that they're a superhero, that they're not something to be feared, but rather quite adorable. And so we changed that narrative from scary to cool and cute. And I mean, if you look at this photo, can you really say that's a scary bat or just an absolutely adorable little critter that we need to protect and save? So we can all be their superheroes. And I encourage you all to take whatever knowledge you learned from tonight out into your community and share it with family and friends. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Wow, Kim, that is amazing. And a ton of information and a ton of really helpful tips about, you know, a hopeful message about what we can do to help bats. So thank you so much for that. And now, everybody, please join me in welcoming Dan Ardia, who's going to give us more of a local and a regional perspective on how our bats are doing more closer to Lancaster.
All right. Well, thank you. That really was excellent, Kim. I hope I can follow with some additional information here. So as you heard in the intro, my primary expertise is working with birds, but I've really become interested in bats and mammals from the 15 years I've lived here in Lancaster. And my entryway to being interested in bats came from seeing them right in Lancaster City. I live right on the edge of the city, and I'm always fascinated how organisms are adjusting either positively or negatively to urban environments. And so I'm still learning about bats. I'll talk a little bit about the research that I'm doing, but what I'd like to do is just sort of walk you through some interesting natural history information about bats, reinforce some of the ideas about how bats might be threatened, and then talk a little bit about challenges of urban living. So I grabbed Kim's slide here. These are Pennsylvania bats. As you've heard, these are the species that we would see if we were able to survey all across Pennsylvania. But of course, not all bat species are equally common or widely distributed. So this is a range map of Pennsylvania. It's relatively older information, about 20 or so years. And so I put a picture here of both the little brown and the big brown bat. which have been reported in every county in the state of Pennsylvania. So these are widespread animals that are able to use a wide range of conditions. And it's probably worth noting as well, this is an information sheet from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Program. So the two species of bats that seem to be most common to show up in our houses here in the Lancaster area are the big brown and the little brown bats. And so this image I'll let you look at while I talk for a minute, just shows you some of the key morphological differences between them. We frequently get bats, or at least we did in the early part of the fall, and they were almost only little brown bats. Generally, we get bats in our houses because they are young males that have been kicked out of the colonies and they're searching around for new places to settle. Bats will return, as many of you know, to the same colony over and over again. So it's only those individuals that are seeking out new places are the ones that are often going into our homes. So if, for example, you do get a bat and you're interested in how to tell the difference, this little graphic can give you a sense that big brown bats are larger and have larger noses. Some bats are distributed across a fair number of counties in the state, but aren't found everywhere. Here's a couple of relatively common species, the silver-haired and the hoary bat. And you'll notice that Lancaster County is not noted on this, although we have records from our acoustic monitoring that shows that they're at least passing through during migration. And so this reinforces the important point that it's really hard to study bats to get a sense of their population numbers, their presence, their absence. Birds are much more visible. We know a lot more about bird population numbers and bird species distribution. Some bats are quite uncommon, like this evening bat. The distribution of counties here suggests that some of this is just random chance of who saw them. The ecological similarities across those counties are not great. So just to kind of put North American bats in context for a second, this is a heat map produced by the U.S. Geological Service in concert with one of the most powerful bat conservation groups all over the world. If you're really interested in supporting bat conservation organizations, I highly encourage you to go to this BCI website and support them as a member. So this just shows you some of the species diversity in general. There's a trend for almost every kind of organism that the farther south you go towards the equator, the greater the species diversity there might be, and there's many reasons for that. You can see here in Pennsylvania, our species diversity isn't super high, but of course, as you get farther north, as it gets colder, the diversity gets lower. So as I said, it's really hard to tell how big bat populations are. So I'm just going to walk you through just a couple methods that people use. So professionals use what we call direct colony counts, and these are not something you should do. You shouldn't really been visiting caves to search for bats anyway, but now with white nose, that's really an important vector for disease transmission. So please don't go into caves and look for bats. This is something that's done by professionals using equipment that's sanitized between visits. And so this is one of the best ways to get these numbers to go and check for presence or absence. But there are ways that we can assist. And so there's been a widespread effort to do what we would call emergence counts, where people go and they sit near places where bat colonies have been seen, and you record and estimate numbers of bats that come out. This provides important information on the timing of when bats might emerge in the spring or begin hibernating in the fall, as well as important citizen science numbers. And so there's programs here in Pennsylvania. This is from Pennsylvania Game Commission up here, the Appalachian Bat Count, where you yourself could get the materials and go out and count colonies. And then there's many other states. I just have a screen capture here from New Hampshire, but the same idea where you could, if you were interested, join this effort and collect important information on bat colonies. So I want to walk us through the life cycle of bats through the year and talk a little bit about some threats and a little bit about their natural history. So if you think of bats sort of on 4 general phases, we could look first at sort of when a bat is born. It's raised, of course, with its mother. Eventually, it'll grow up, either stay in the colony. Usually, if it's a female or if it's a young male, it'll be kicked out, and then it'll begin migrating. And as you heard, wind turbines surprisingly kill a lot of bats. They're often attracted to the lights that are on wind turbines, and they can get hit, and it's a significant source of mortality. And I'll talk a little bit more about migration. Then bats would overwinter. Often not in the same place that they bred, and emerge depending on whatever temperature cues there were, and then mate. So we'll talk through some of these. So bats have a really interesting reproductive cycle that I think highlights one of the really cool sort of evolutionary pathways that animals have evolved, and bats have all these really, really interesting adaptations that make them unique. And so this just shows a life cycle from a paper from a few years ago that shows some of the key periods. Here they're focusing on the hormones that female bats are producing that are causing them to breed. And those hormones shown here in these different lines are lower when they're in hibernation, and then there's a peak period of the year in which they are reproducing. But one thing that's interesting about bats is not all bats live in colonies with mates. And so bats have evolved all kinds of interesting adaptations where they might mate in, for example, the fall or the winter, and then store sperm and fertilize an egg right before pregnancy begins, or they may actually fertilize right away, but then store the embryo and it develops later. So there's all these really interesting adaptations that are associated with the probability and timing of finding a mate. And many times bats are gestating their young ones in just the very end of the winter in order to then produce young right when the weather warms up. So that's a really cool set of adaptations that we see in a lot of bats. Bats show a whole wide range of reproductive styles. I don't expect us all to be able to interpret this whole diagram, but it shows us just the different, each of these are different sort of characteristics of mating systems that we see in bats. And so on one end, we see what we would call monogamy, a classic sort of one male, one female working together to raise offspring. And some bat species do show that. But depending again on the access to mates, we may have cases when we have multiple females and a single male, or we may have cases where there's multiple males that are displaying in some way and females come, or we may have cases where colonies are all males and females together and they show promiscuity. Lots of really interesting adaptations that bats show. And all these things are going on, of course, in caves and colonies that we might never see. Of course, bats are famous, at least the group of bats that we have here in North America, for their echolocation. And interestingly, bats have a very early split in evolution where they give rise to a group of bats that do not show echolocation. These tend to be found in the old world areas. They tend to be much larger, things like you might have heard of like fruit bats. And as Kim mentioned, there are cases where people are catching bats and eating them, and those are often these large fruit bats. In North America, the only bats that we have all show this echolocation, which is like sonar. They're sending out a signal, a particular wavelength that gets disrupted when it hits a prey item and then sends that information back. And if any of you watched a bat forage, they're doing it in ways that make it clear that they're gathering information about their environment. So this just shows, again, to reinforce the idea that bats have all these really cool adaptations and that those adaptations tend to fit the particular kind of environment that they're found in. So these are just two different images for two different species of bats, and we're looking at what's called a spectrogram here. So here's the time along this axis and the frequency of the echolocation signal that they're sending. And those are very characteristic, as I'll talk about in a second. And so the kind of wavelength, the speed at which it goes, the frequency at which it occurs is a really strong fit for the kind of environment that they're found in. So bats that would be found in more forested environments would have evolved to produce signals that would pass through vegetation or that wouldn't be blocked and reflected. Whereas bats that would hunt, for example, like this little brown bat here out in the open air, would evolve particular wavelengths that would be well suited for those kinds of conditions. So here's just another diagram that shows us all of the different ways that bats might forage. And so some bats really do forage up high in open areas. Other bats forage lower to the ground, but in open spaces, and other bats forage right in and around the trees. And so they would be expected then to have a suite of echolocation adaptations as well as morphological adaptations that would suit that lifestyle. How do we study the diets of bats? Well, the easiest way is to look at poop. Guano is the fancy term for bat droppings. And if you've ever had bats in your house or gone into a cave where there's a lot of bats, you see a lot of guano. Guano is been an important source for trade over the years. Bird guano and bat guano has been used to develop gunpowder. So these colonies are often people come in and harvest. But in this case, researchers would be interested in determining what the foods were that bats were eating. And so you can collect these. In the older days, people would go through them painstakingly looking for pieces of different kinds of insects and produce diagrams like this one here, where you might, for example, look at the time of year and the proportion of food that was made up of various kinds of insect groups to get a sense for what the most important food types were and whether that changed seasonally. People still do this kind of work, but often they'll use it using DNA. It can be a little bit easier to extract out the different insect groups and then run that through some kind of a PCR where you amplify the DNA, and then you can look at the kind of food that they eat. Bats around here are eating insects, of course, not surprisingly, especially when they're feeding young. It is clear that bats eat mosquitoes, although I think that mosquitoes make up a lower proportion of their diet than we might hope, in part because a mosquito has a lot less mass to feed hungry young bats than does a big beetle or a moth. So, and this is just another image that shows some of the seasonal changes. So if we think about seasonal changes, so if we have bats that now have grown up and are leaving the place where they were born, bats are actually quite migratory, much more than people realize. This is just an image of one of Pennsylvania's bat species, the hoary bat, showing how it moves. So it breeds all the way up here into far northern United States and Canada, but then might migrate literally thousands of miles to spend the winter in places that are warmer. So some bats might stay year-round in one place and go into a colony and hibernate. Other bats might migrate and feed for longer periods and then hibernate there and migrate back. Here's just another image. This is from the red bat, showing its summer range here, again, extending up into some pretty colder climates, and then where we find it when it migrates. So as I mentioned, my interest in bats came from observing them in urban habitats. I teach at Franklin and Marshall College, right on the edge of Lancaster City, and I live close by campus. And I often see bats in the evening and in the mornings from my house. And I was often curious as to what the factors were in the urban environment that might have attracted them. So I started using a new and exciting tool, this thing called an audio moth here, which is the fancy name for it, is a passive acoustic monitor. It's just simply a little microphone that records. So you can see the microphone here. It's a circuit board. It turns on and off whenever I program it. It records frequencies that I tell it to record. And then I can pull out the SD card and I can see which bats have come by comparing those characteristic echolocation signals to a known library to see which bats have been picked up. So my students and I started by asking whether bats were more common closer to Lancaster City than versus out into the countryside. And so we utilized lots of faculty and staff and friends here at Franklin and Marshall, as well as students and other places. And each of these dots shows a place that we put up loggers over the years, trying to work on a gradient out from Lancaster City. Unfortunately, we were really about to ramp this work up when COVID hit, and we pulled back a fair bit, but I'm able to show you some of our preliminary results. So here, just with these images showing larger blocks for the bats that we found the most of, show that we pick up a fair number of bats. Now, these data should be taken with somewhat of a caveat, because remember, I'm trying to match up a recording with a library, and there could be false hits. And so some of these rare species may not actually be occurring. But a few take-home messages. First, that we're not picking up, our most common bats are not actually the big brown and the little brown bat, even though we know those are common in the city. But interestingly, we're picking up the movement of bats as they migrate. So here are just some images that show us some of the seasonality. And so this was fall data collected a few years ago, and the sampling round are weeks in the fall. And we pick up, for example, some bats at high numbers, but then they drop off. And so we were really interested in how climate change, hoping to build a long-term data set to see how warming and more extreme temperatures might change the timing of hibernation and the beginning of spring emergence. But one take-home message from this work is that migrating bats pass through the city and are getting picked up in our loggers. So if you're sitting out on a July afternoon, you might see a big brown or a little brown bat. But if you're out looking for bats in September or October, you would see some new bats passing through, like a hoary bat or a red bat, for example. So let's talk a little bit about urban areas. As I said, bats are in urban systems. Are these good habitats for them, or are they features of their the bats' landscape that are drawing them in because they have cues that bats historically have used to indicate where food sources are, but might have negative effects? So I'm going to show you some data from work done by other people studying bats. So this is a study where researchers went out and they recorded bat foraging at night, and they compared it to the amount of light pollution that was around, and they were also interested in how it related to the canopy of trees in the city. So this diagram here shows the degree of light pollution. So this would be areas down here that were dark, areas that were quite bright. And then this is 3 different levels of tree canopy cover, the red being places with a lot of trees, blue without. You can see that in general, the more artificial light there was, the more activity there was from bats, but the effect was most pronounced in places where there were a lot of trees. In other words, areas of the city where this work was done in Germany, where there were a lot of trees, bats left those forested areas in cities and went and foraged by streetlights. Another place where bats are attracted to cities that may not be always a good thing is for roosting. And so most bats have evolved to nest in either caves that have very constant temperatures and are protected from predators, or in large cavities in big old trees. As both of those features of the environment have become less common, bats have evolved to use other cues and have begun roosting in cities. We know that cats, whether they be your friendly, lovable house cat or whether they be feral cats, kept alive by people who feed them, thinking that that's the best choice for nature. Cats kill a tremendous number of bats. Other predators like raccoons, bats can be stressed out from high metabolic rate, from warmer temperatures in cities, and also from light pollution. This is a really cool study where researchers looked at artificial light that they placed in the environment. So the picture here shows some artificial lights that researchers placed in habitats that did not already have lights. And the impetus here was to study the suite of bats that were not normally found with people, but as cities encroached into natural habitats, to see what effect they would have. And they found that bat species that normally don't live around lights are actually repelled by lights and will move distances and increase their energetic expenditure in order to avoid getting exposed to these lights. So I just want to highlight that artificial lighting has negative effects in general in cities. This is a recent study that was done looking just at the effect of artificial lights on insects, and it's a pretty complicated figure, and I'll just go through it super quick. And so here the line would be the difference between lower numbers would be places where they found fewer insects when they put out artificial lights, and here would be places where they found more insects. In other words, any number you see down here would be places where insects were influenced negatively by lights, and here are places where insects were influenced positively by lights. So this is just a little bit of scientific data to come with a very clear message that as much as you can turn off your outside lights at night, whether they be on your garage or your front porch, please do that. That's better for insects. So the last thing I want to just leave us with is to think about how all these factors might work together to influence bats. And so if we think of something we might want to know, center here, bat abundance and diversity in urban environments, what are the kinds of things that would either positively or negatively affect bats? So I talked a little bit about light pollution, and so artificial light at night can have really strong negative effects on lots of different organisms. I also talked about food availability and also about roosts. We know that noise can have an important effect on bats, and some bat species have actually changed their echolocation calls in order to avoid overlap with road noise. And of course, bats are also often hit by cars. I wanted to leave a little time for questions, so we've got 10 minutes here or so to answer any questions that you have, and I just thank you all for coming out on this beautiful fall evening.
Wow, thanks, Dan, and Kim, if you can come back on. I've got a couple of questions that folks have placed in the chat and the Q&A box, and if you have any questions that come up during this part of the presentation, please use that Q&A box to let us know what they are. And so I think I'm going to start with you, Kim, and Dan. Certainly, feel free to jump in, both of you, as we go through these. So, Kim, you mentioned, and I think rightfully so, about the negative image that bats have, and that a big part of the battle is really changing that image from, to the superheroes that they truly are. And part of that negative image, I think, is the perception that they are disease vectors, including rabies. And you did mention, how the misinformation surrounding the COVID transmission from bats to humans. Are you able to comment on bats carrying rabies and the incidence of that? And are there any particular populations across the country that are more prone to rabies than others?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I don't know if I can speak too much to the research on rabies, but I do know that there's a perception that bats carry rabies. Do you want to go grab a bat and let it bite you? No, but you don't want to do that with any wildlife. And so the incidence of people getting rabies from bats is like one, or even them having rabies is very, very low. If you find bats inside your house, the best thing to do is attempt to open a door, turn off all the lights, get out of that room, and let the bat get itself out. If it's so sickly that it's just crawling around, you really want to either call an animal control or get someone to come and assist you with it, or otherwise try to get it out perhaps by putting a thick pillowcase or something over it and easing it out the door. As far as rabies is concerned and incidence of rabies, I really can't speak to the statistics on that. I know they can carry it. I know the incidence of people actually getting bit by a rabid bat is extremely low. There's more perception that they're going to carry rabies and get stuck in your hair and bite your neck than reality in that case. And I can't really speak to any kind of regional differences, but maybe Dan would have some more insights to that.
Dan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just support that bats get a bad reputation because they end up in our house, but they have lower incidence than, I mean, any wild animal has a chance. The chance is low. And as Kim said, it's best to not handle a bat directly, but to help it get out of the house if it can.
Yeah. You know, if you handle something, if you grab something, it's going to grab you back, right? Regardless of what that something is. So it's just a good course to not go grabbing things. How about I want to explore white nose syndrome a little bit, because that really continues to break my heart, right? I mean, I was an avid caver before white nose syndrome hit, and really enjoyed the biology of those caves. And it was largely based on bats coming and going and the guano that they added to that ecosystem, and just the devastating effect that white nose syndrome has had on really common species that used to be common, that aren't anymore, that I never thought would be worried about, little brown bat going away. But I've heard a little glimmer of hope that there seems to be some immunity in certain bat colonies, in certain bat populations. Can either of you confirm or deny that? Is that rumor that I'm hearing of potential immunity in certain North American bats founded in any kind of science?
I mean, my impression is that there are positive suggestions that some individuals might be able to weather the storm, so to speak, and that, of course, given the strong selection pressure, that if that trait is heritable, it'll pass around very quickly. It might be interesting to note for everyone that the way white nose tends to kill bats is not by necessarily making them sick and dying right then and there, but it causes their hibernation to be interrupted. So the bat will be hibernating, and then its metabolic rate will turn on as it fights a little infection, and then it will lose a little energy and go back again. And so it's this sort of slow, sad ratchet that causes the bats to not be able to breed or to die of starvation. But there are a lot of people working on the immunity of it, and there is some suggestion there are some genetic variants that may be more tolerant.
And then Kim, you were talking about, I believe it was you who was talking about European bats in terms of white nose. And do you know if the European bats actually develop the fungal infection but just don't become symptomatic? So can you see the fungus growing on those European bats, or does the fungi not even set up shop in the European bat?
Yeah, my understanding, and again, I'm not one of the researchers that is working on white nose syndrome, but my understanding is that they will get it, but they have different conditions such that they are better adapted to it. For example, some of the European bats have larger body size. Some of their metabolism plays a role in whether they come down with white nose syndrome. Also, the conditions of their caves are different. So the humidity, the temperature of the caves that they're located in will affect the spread of the fungus on their bodies. And so there are some variables that our scientists are playing with to try to figure out what's the mix to save them and what's the mix that's been killing them. And I think the biggest take home for me when it comes to white nose syndrome and the differences between Europe and the US is that any introduced fungus, any introduced pathogen, any introduced zoonosis, any introduced anything is coming into an environment that is ill prepared to defend itself against it. And so kudzu as a plant, I mean, all types of things that interfere with our body's ability or our environment's ability to be in balance are going to hit hard and fast. And the impacts to bats right now is devastating when it comes in and just wipes out an entire cave full of bats. The little guys just cannot replace themselves fast enough. And some of these bats are living 32 years in the wild if they're allowed to just reproduce, but they're only reproducing like one pup a year. And so they just cannot bring themselves back. They're not rodents, they're not reproducing in high numbers, and they just can't come back fast enough. We're expecting evolution to be on a short timeline, and it's just not the impact that we're seeing.
Yeah, so, North American bat susceptibility to white nose isn't necessarily anything unique about their immune system. It's just the fact that they haven't been exposed to this pathogen in the past, so they have no immunity to it, correct?
Yeah, evolution plays a role here, and just the drastic impacts that have been seen. It's too much and it's overwhelming. I'm kind of like when COVID hit us. Are we ready to resist it? Not really, because it's a novel coronavirus. So any kind of pathogen, any kind of zoonosis is going to slam you first, and then the strong will survive, and we try to figure out how to help them adapt. We are trying to come up with a remedy for white nose syndrome, but we just don't have it yet.
Yeah, wow. And Dan, you mentioned that little browns, and certainly in my experience, in the past anyway, little browns were very, very abundant. Can you comment on their current status, their current abundance locally?
I mean, we certainly see fewer than we would have expected, but they're still certainly around. I mean, and ironically, the ones that are probably in cities and in smaller colonies are able to, if it's just from a transmission perspective, that, the fungus passes through a big colony. And so, I mean, some of it goes back to what I said earlier. It's really hard to study bat populations. And if we're mostly focusing on big colonies for good reason, then we might not really have a very good sense of the smaller groups. And so it's really an area where citizen science can play an important role for people reporting their bat sightings. Great.
And what citizen science program would you recommend that folks get involved with if they are interested in contributing to that?
Well, I mean, the emergence count one that the Pennsylvania Game Commission would be a good one. I would probably have to do a little research, and maybe we could pass it along to all the attendees. So I don't know if Kim has any that popped to mind for her.
Great. So it's a scary time. Certainly for anybody that sees the value of bats. And Kim, I agree with you. I think they're the cutest things on wings. I mean, they really are adorable. And I've got experience handling bats, and they're not aggressive. I used to go and get bats out of dormitories when I was in college, and they were not ever making any attempt to bite me. And I was trained and gloved and all that other good stuff. So, don't do it without knowing what you're doing. But they're not the aggressive, mean things that they're made out to be. They are beautiful, cute, cuddly things that perform critically important ecosystem functions that directly affect our health as humans. And it's a scary time for these things. But I think there's also glimmers of hope in that there are some simple actions that I think people can take to help bats. And we mentioned some of those. Something as simple as turning off your porch lights that help not just bats, but also birds and insects. And there's numerous studies that show that. Going native in your yard, Kim, I think you mentioned that, and certainly your connection, your work with pollinators informs that quite a bit. But if we just each of us just converts a small part of our yard into a native pollinator garden, that helps all of our native pollinators. Critically, not critically endangered yet, but certainly declining in number monarch butterflies, for example. And bat boxes came up. And my experience with bat boxes is they're kind of tough to get bats to come and set up shop in those boxes. Do you have any tips on how that box should be hung, height off the ground, facing direction? I've heard all these different variables that play into whether a bat's going to actually utilize that box or not. And also, a lot of times the mud daubers and the paper wasps really like those places. And so if we have mud daubers and paper wasps setting up shop in those bat boxes, should we remove those mud daubers and paper wasps, or can the bats cohabitate with those wasps?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to get the mud daubers and the paper wasps out because they're not going to want anybody messing with their nest either. So pick one. Do you want the insects or do you want the mammals in there? The best location for a bat box is on a pole. Ironically, a lot of people think they can just slap it onto the side of a tree or maybe off their porch. That's not always the best choice for various reasons. Trees present some branches and things that might get in the way. The bats literally need to come out of their box and drop down up to about 10 feet. So you want to have at least a clear zone directly beneath the bat box of 10 to 15 feet. We recommend that you put them on posts so that they are away from any other kind of predators or wildlife that might crawl up into it, and not on a tree. So it sounds a little counterintuitive that you would put it on this weird looking pole, but that ends up being like the safest, best place. If you have a lot of wind, you don't want it shaking around. So you want it to be a very well-positioned pole, and you want it to get roughly around 7 hours of maybe sunlight during the day and be positioned kind of in an east to southeast, depending on what you've got in terms of shade and things around, so that it can receive some light throughout the day. So it's difficult to get the right conditions for a bat box, but you want to go ahead and give it a shot and just see if you can get them in there versus your attic or other parts that you may not want them to be roosting in.
Thanks. And so, both Dan and Kim, you both mentioned multiple stressors affecting our bats. White nose syndrome being one of those, energy development in terms of wind development being another, and habitat loss. And we've accomplished preserving our 8,000th acre forever as a small little land conservancy, which I think is just absolutely phenomenal. And maybe could you comment on the importance of that habitat protection, that land protection that the Conservancy directly engages in terms of protecting bat populations?
I mean, I would just say that, we know that some species are much more forest dependent. And so even if urban areas do turn out to be okay for certain species of bats, others will never use them. So just having intact, large, continuous quality forests will help keep our biodiversity up. And of course, we know insect populations are under multiple stressors and are plummeting. And so just the diversity of habitats that the Conservancy protects will help keep insect populations up, which will help, all the resultant parts of the food web that are based on that.
Yeah. So Kim and Dan, thank you so much. We're out of time for any additional questions. I really, really appreciate all the time that you put into this presentation. I thought it was absolutely wonderful how we got a larger, even a global perspective, but certainly a national perspective, and learning about the really hopeful actions that some of our federal partners are working on to protect bats, and then bringing that closer to home with bat ecology and bat conservation efforts here in Lancaster. Folks, if you want to help the Conservancy, don't forget Extra Give coming up in a couple of weeks. Our 8,000th acre has been preserved. We want to keep on doing that for bats and pollinators and birds and everything else that depends on that incredible open space, including us humans. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.